pushed off a cliff to hide a bastard print, but I didn't hit the ground. I hit the arms of the one monster my alpha feared. Now the story Elara's world didn't just end. It shattered when she felt the alpha's palm slam into her chest. The wind didn't scream as she fell, but she did. A raw, jagged sound that tore through the mountain mist. She plummeted toward the jagged teeth of the abyss, her hands clutching at a belly that held the only thing she loved. Truth be told, she had hidden her pregnancy for months because she knew Alpha Varric would cull a weak Omega's pup. She had lived as a ghost in her own pack, eaten bitter herbs to mask her scent, all while her heart hammered like a trapped bird. But then, the Alpha had scented the truth. He didn't just exile her, he chose to erase her. Her heart skipped as the ground rushed up to meet her. A cold grey death waiting in the shadows. What followed was a roar that shook the very foundations of the earth. In that moment, a shadow broader than the cliff face eclipsed the sun. Before she could move, a pair of massive furred arms snatched her from the air, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. This wasn't death, it was the heat of a predator. As if fate demanded it, she looked up into the eyes of molten silver. She was being held by King Malakor, the ancient Lycan whose name was used to frighten pups into silence. His wings, made of silver-veined shadow, snapped open with a sound like a thunderclap, banking against the gravity that meant to kill her. Beneath the moonlight, he looked like a god of war and mercy combined into one lethal frame. Next, the world tilted as he ascended, the speed making her ears pop and her breath catch. Elara's body moved on instinct, her fingers digging into the thick, dark fur of his chest. Because he was a Lycan, he smelled of ozone and ancient storms, a scent that shouldn't have felt like home but did. She felt the bond pulse, a low rhythmic thrumming that started in her soul and echoed in his. Without thinking, she pressed her face against him, sobbing into his heart as the cliff she had been pushed from shrank to a tiny dot. What would you do if the monster of your nightmares became the only thing keeping you from the grave? Soon after, they reached the highest spire of the Sunless Citadel, a fortress carved into the clouds. Malakor set her down on a bed of soft moss, his wings tucking behind him like a royal cloak. Her voice trembled as she looked at him, her legs feeling like water. Why did you catch me?" she whispered, her chest aching with a mix of terror and gratitude. The king didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Under the weight of his stare, she felt exposed, as if he could see the life growing inside her and the scars on her heart. In the quiet that followed, he leaned down, his muzzle grazing her ear. "Because you are the first thing in 1,000 years that made me want to fly," he rumbled. At that moment, something inside her shifted. She wasn't just a discarded Omega anymore. Her wolf pressed forward, answering the call of a king who saw her not as trash, but as a treasure. Even so, the shadow of Varric still loomed at the base of the mountain. What followed was a choice: stay in the shadows of the king's fortress, or embrace a power she never knew she had. Moments later, Malakor shifted, his bones cracked and reset in a dance of raw power. And rather than the monster, a man stood before her, tall, scarred, and undeniably beautiful. His eyes remained silver, locking onto hers with a predatory focus that made fire bloom beneath her skin. "You are safe here, Elara," he said, his voice a low velvet caress. "But safety has a price." Truth be told, she didn't care about the price as long as her pup lived. She felt the mark on her soul tingle, a burning heat that told her she was no longer alone. As the silence roared, she realized her life hadn't ended at the cliff. It had simply begun. By the time the moon reached its peak, Elara sat by a roaring fire in the king's private chambers. She watched him move with the fluid grace of a hunter, his every step echoing the power he held over this land. Not only that, but he had brought her food and furs without being asked. She didn't know what scared her more, the alpha who wanted her dead, or the king who made her feel so alive. "Varric will come for me," she said, her voice small against the crackle of the wood. Malakor stopped, turning to face her with a grim smile. To make things worse, she knew the alpha wouldn't come alone. On the other hand, Malakor seemed to relish the thought of a fight. He approached her, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, and she felt it, etched in fire. "Let him come," the king whispered, his eyes flashing silver. "I have spent centuries waiting for a reason to tear a pack apart." Without another word, he leaned in, his lips ghosting over hers in a promise of protection and passion. Her world tilted again, but this time she didn't fear the fall. She was in the arms of a king, and for the first time in her life, she let it happen. Still, a question burned in the back of her mind as she looked at his wings. Why was a king of the sky living in a citadel of stone? Before she could speak, he stood and walked to the balcony, looking out over the clouds. The air thickened with subtext, a secret hanging between them like a heavy fog. She knew there was more to his rescue than just mercy. Deep down, she knew the truth. He needed her just as much as she needed him. As the sky darkened, she realized that her journey was just beginning, and the true battle for her soul was yet to come. That night, Elara dreamt of flying on wings of silver light. She saw herself rising above the Iron Claw pack, her voice a roar that silenced Varric forever. Come morning, she woke to the sound of horns echoing from the valley below. The great hunt had arrived. The Varric stood at the base of the spire, his eyes full of hate and his heart set on murder. But then, Elara looked at Malakor, who was already shifting, his wings spreading wide to catch the morning sun. The space between them burned with a new resolve. "Teach me," she said, her voice firm. "Teach me to fly." And as the forest watched, the king took her hand, ready to show the world that an Omega could become a god. Elara's world didn't just end, it shattered when she saw the first plume of oily black smoke rising from the base of the mountain. The horns of the Iron Claw pack didn't just sound, they screamed, a raw, jagged warning that Varric had found her. She stood on the balcony of the Sunless Citadel, her hands white-knuckled as they gripped the stone railing. Truth be told, she had hoped for more than a single night of peace before her past caught up to her. She looked down at the swirling mist, her heart hammering like a trapped bird against the ribs that still ached from the fall. But then, a heavy warmth settled over her shoulders. Malakor was there, his scent of stormy cedar wrapping around her like a shield. His silver eyes weren't looking at the smoke, they were looking at her with a predatory focus that made her soul answer. What followed was a low, rumbling growl that started deep in the king's chest. In that moment, the air around them thickened, turning heavy with the weight of his rising power. Before she could move, Malakor stepped in front of her, his massive frame blocking out the sight of the approaching army. "He burns the forest because he is a coward who fears the heights," the king hissed, his voice a low velvet caress that promised violence. As if fate demanded it, Elara felt a spark of fire bloom beneath her skin, a silver heat that answered his anger. She wasn't just a discarded Luna anymore, she was the reason a king was baring his teeth. Next, the ground beneath them trembled as the first of Varric's berserkers hit the lower spires, their claws scraping against the ancient stone like a nightmare come to life. Soon after, Malakor turned to her, his face a mask of grim resolve. "Go to the inner sanctum, Elara. The smoke, it carries the scent of wolfsbane," he warned, his voice straining as his bones began to shift. Her heart skipped because she knew what that meant. The Alpha wasn't just hunting her, he was trying to ground the Lycans. Why she didn't want to leave him. But the mark on her soul tingled with a frantic urgency to protect the life inside her. Without thinking, she pressed her palm to his chest, feeling the frantic rhythm of a heart that beat only for the sky. What would you do if the only man who ever saw your worth was about to dive into a sea of monsters? Moments later, the first wave of attackers cleared the ledge. They were massive, foam-flecked beasts that smelled of rot and raw blood. Elara's body moved on instinct, her feet stepping back as a berserker lunged, its teeth snapping inches from her throat. But then, Malakor was there, a blur of silver-veined shadow and fury. He didn't just fight, he decimated. His wings snapped open with a sound like a thunderclap, the force of the wind sending the beast tumbling back into the abyss. Still, more were coming, their eyes red with a drug-induced madness that ignored the height. In the span of a breath, the balcony became a slaughterhouse. Elara watched as Malakor tore through the ranks, his claws flashing like lightning in the darkening sky. Yet, for every one he dropped, 2 more took its place. To make things worse, the wolfsbane smoke was rising higher, turning the air into a toxic fog that made the Lycan guards stumble and cough. Under the weight of his stare, Elara saw Malakor look back at her, his silver eyes clouded with pain. He was being grounded. He was being trapped. He was being broken. Because of that, a choice was made that made her world tilt. Elara didn't run for the sanctum. Instead, she ran toward the edge. No matter how hard she tried to suppress it, the silver fire in her blood erupted, a blinding light that pushed back the oily smoke. Because she was a descendant of the celestial line, her power didn't answer to the earth, it answered to the stars. She felt a strange, agonizing pressure in her shoulders, a feeling of bones stretching, a feeling of skin tearing, a feeling of power rising that made her voice tremble. "Malakor!" she screamed, her hand reaching out as a berserker lunged at his exposed back. Without warning, the silver light from her palms hit the beast, incinerating its fur and sending it howling into the mist. At that moment, the king looked at her with a mix of awe and terror. He had saved her from the fall, but now she was the one holding the line. In the quiet that followed the blast, the smoke seemed to part around her, as if the mountain itself was bowing to its true queen. Still, the transformation wasn't complete. Her soul answered the call, but her body wasn't ready to fly. Not yet. That night, the citadel felt like a cage under siege. The berserkers had been repelled for the moment, but the fires below were still burning, a ring of orange hate surrounding the mountain. Elara sat in the shadows of the great hall, her chest aching and her hands still glowing with a faint, ghostly silver. Malakor approached her, his human form scarred and bloodied, his eyes never leaving her face. "You shouldn't have stayed," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Truth be told, she knew he was right, but she also knew she could never go back to being a ghost because she had finally tasted the freedom of the storm. Rather than fear him, she reached out and traced the new scars on his chest. As her name left his lips, the space between them burned with a passion that made the war outside feel 1,000 miles away. "I am not a prize to be kept, Malakor," she said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion. "I am a weapon." The king didn't argue. Instead, he leaned in, his forehead resting against hers as the bond pulsed between them like a living thing. Before either could speak, a distant roar echoed from the valley. Varric was tired of waiting. As if fate whispered a warning, the ground shook again. But this time, it wasn't the berserkers. The Alpha had brought something else, a siege engine made of silver and spite. What followed was a night of terror as the first of the silver bolts hit the citadel walls, the metal singing a song of death to anyone with shifter blood. Elara looked at Malakor, and for the first time she saw a flicker of doubt in the king's eyes. He could fly, but he couldn't protect her from a sky filled with silver. That's why she stood up, her bones remembering the feeling of the wind. She had to learn to fly, not just for herself, but to save the man who taught her that she was worth the catch. And as the silence roared, she let the silver fire take hold. The silver fire didn't just burn, it screamed through Elara's veins like a caged sun trying to break free. The citadel walls groaned as another silver bolt slammed into the stone, sending a shower of sparks and masonry flying. She stood in the center of the great hall, her hands trembling as the ghostly light from her palms flickered and pulsed. Deep down, she knew the truth. She felt like a glass vase being filled with molten lead, her human skin too small for the celestial power rising within. She looked at Malakor, whose face was a mask of agony as the hum of the silver weaponry nearby vibrated through his very bones. But then, a new sensation took hold. A cold, sharp clarity that cut through the panic. Her heart skipped because she realized the silver wasn't just a threat to their lives, it was a cage for their souls. What followed was a moment of desperate clarity that made her world tilt. At that moment, Elara realized that if they stayed behind these walls, they were simply waiting for the executioner. Before she could move, Malakor staggered toward her, his hand reaching out to pull her away from the vibrating stone. "We have to move to the lower caves, Elara. The deeper the rock, the less the silver can sing," he groaned, his voice a ragged shadow of its usual strength. As if fate demanded it, she felt her wolf stir, not with the submissive whimper of an omega, but with the territorial snarl of a queen. She wasn't going to hide in a hole like a wounded animal. Next, the air in the hall exploded as a third bolt pierced the roof, the metal glowing with a sickly violet light that made the shadows dance like demons. Soon after, Malakor's guards began to retreat, their wings dragging on the floor as the silver frequency stripped them of their grace. Elara's body moved on instinct. She didn't head for the caves, she headed for the king. Because he was the heart of this mountain. His pain was her pain, and her soul answered with a roar. She grabbed his face, her glowing palms framing his jaw, and the moment their eyes locked, the silver fire jumped from her skin to his. Still, he didn't burn. Instead, his expression smoothed into a look of shocked relief. What would you do if the very thing that made you a monster was the only thing that could shield the one you loved. In the span of a breath, the great hall became a laboratory of divine power. Elara watched as the silver light from her hands began to form a shimmering veil around Malakor, a barrier that silenced the screaming of the silver bolts. Yet, the cost was immediate. Her chest ached with a hollow, freezing vacuum as her energy drained into the shield. To make things worse, a secondary explosion rocked the balcony, and through the dust, she saw Varric's elite silver hounds scaling the breach. Under the weight of his stare, Elara saw Malakor realize what she was doing. He was being protected. He was being empowered. He was being reborn. Because of that, the king stood tall once more, his silver eyes flashing with a light that matched her own. Elara didn't stop, she pushed harder, the fire blooming beneath her skin until her vision went white. Because she was the Alpha's greatest mistake, she was the only one who knew how to break his toys. She felt a strange, agonizing pressure in her throat. A feeling of a roaring building, a feeling of a command rising, a feeling of a goddess waking that made the stone floor crack. "Enough!" she screamed, her voice echoing with a frequency that shattered the violet light of the silver bolts. Without warning, the shield expanded, a dome of moonlight that threw the silver hounds back over the edge like discarded dolls. In that moment, the king looked at her with a mix of reverence and terror. He had taught her to fly, but she was showing him how to rule. In the quiet that followed the blast, the heavy vibration of the siege engines stopped, the metal outside failing under the weight of her celestial pulse. Still, the victory was a heavy one. Her soul answered the call, but her legs gave out, her body hitting the mossy floor before Malakor could catch her. That night, the citadel was a place of whispers and healing. The fires below were still burning, a ring of orange hate surrounding the mountain, but the silver song had been silenced for now. Elara woke in the king's bedchamber, her hands pale and cold once more. The silver light retreated deep into her marrow. Malakor sat beside her, his large hand resting near her stomach, his touch a gentle tether to the real world. "You saved us, Elara," he whispered, his voice thick with a vulnerability he only showed to the dark. Truth be told, she knew the battle wasn't over because she could still feel Varric's presence, a dark stain on the horizon that wouldn't wash away. Rather than answer, she let her fingers entwine with him. As his name left his lips, the space between them burned with a hunger that was more than just physical. It was a survival of the soul. "I am not just an Omega who fell, Malakor," she said, her voice a low hum in the stillness. "I am the light that will burn him out." The king didn't argue. Instead, he leaned down and pressed a kiss to the mark on her neck, the bond pulsing between them like a drum of war. Before either could speak, a new sound echoed from the high peaks, the cry of an ancient creature that hadn't been heard in 1,000 years. As if fate whispered a secret, Elara realized the blast hadn't just stopped the Alpha. It had woken something else, something older than the packs and deeper than the mountain. What followed was a cold shiver down her spine as the shadows in the room began to move of their own accord. Elara looked at Malakor, and for the first time she saw a flicker of ancient memory in the king's eyes. He could fly, but now they both had to learn how to survive the ghosts of the sky. That's why she closed her eyes, because she had to master this power, not just for the war, but for the child who was already learning the rhythm of her magic. And as the silence roared, she let the darkness watch. The shadows didn't just dance. They breathed, curling around the bedposts of the king's chamber like ink dropped into clear water. The high peaks of the Sunless Citadel were no longer just a fortress. They had become a tomb for a secret that had slept for 1,000 years. Elara sat upright, her hands clutching the furs as the silver fire in her blood hummed in a low, warning frequency. Truth be told, she felt like a stranger in her own skin, her body a vessel for a power that was waking the ghosts of the mountain. She looked at Malakor, whose face was pale beneath the moonlight, his eyes fixed on the shifting darkness in the corners of the room. But then, the ancient cry echoed again, a sound that was half metal and half soul, piercing the heavy stone walls. Her heart skipped because she realized the blast of her light hadn't just saved them. It had acted as a beacon for something that had been waiting for a celestial queen to return. What followed was a chilling shift in the air that made her world tilt. In that moment, the shadows coalesced into a figure that was neither wolf nor man. A shimmering wraith of old magic that stood at the foot of their bed. Before she could move, Malakor was on his feet, his claws unsheathing with a metallic snick that cut through the silence. "Stay back, Elara. These are the echoes of the first flight," he warned, his voice a low, vibrating growl of primal defense. As if fate demanded it, she felt her pulse race, the silver mark on her neck burning with a heat that felt like a brand. She wasn't going to let him face the darkness alone after he had snatched her from the jaws of the abyss. Next, the wraith reached out a hand of smoke, and the moment it touched the shield she had cast earlier, the room exploded with a vision of a forgotten war. Soon after, Elara's mind was flooded with images of winged wolves falling from the sky, their silver hearts being torn out by land-bound alphas who feared the sun. Because she was the last of that broken line, the grief of 1,000 ancestors crashed into her soul like a tidal wave. She grabbed Malakor's arm, her glowing fingers sinking into his skin as she shared the vision through the bond. Still, the king didn't pull away. Instead, he roared, his wings snapping open to shield her from the onslaught of memories. What would you do if you realized your entire history was built on a lie, and the man you loved was the heir to the one who started the slaughter? In the span of a breath, the chamber became a whirlpool of light and shadow. Elara watched as the wraith's eyes, the same silver as her own, locked onto her with a desperate hunger. Yet, the revelation was a double-edged sword. She saw Malakor's lineage in the vision, his ancestors leading the charge against the sky shifters. To make things worse, she felt the bond between them crack, a sudden jagged coldness spreading through her chest. Under the weight of his stare, Elara saw the king's own realization. He was a protector, he was a savior, but he was also the son of the throne that had clipped her ancestors' wings. Because of that, the fire in her blood turned from moonlight to lightning. Elara didn't pull back, she stood up, the furs falling away as her skin began to shimmer with an uncontrollable radiance. Because she was the judge of the past, and she was the only one who could decide if the king was worth her mercy. She felt a strange, agonizing pressure in her spine, a feeling of wings pushing, a feeling of a legacy of stars breaking, a feeling of a legacy demanding blood that made the windows shatter outward. "You knew!" she screamed, her voice echoing with a frequency that made Malakor stagger back in pain. Without warning, the wraith lunged, not at Elara, but at the king, its misty claws aiming for the heart that beat for her. In that moment, the king didn't defend himself. He simply looked at her, his silver eyes full of a heartbreaking regret. He had saved her from the cliff, but he couldn't save himself from the sins of his fathers. In the quiet that followed the lunging shadow, Elara's body moved on instinct. She didn't let the ghost strike, she intercepted it. Her hands caught the smoke and tore it apart with a burst of celestial rage. Still, the damage to her heart was done. Her soul answered the call of the sky, but her mind was a battlefield of betrayal. That night, the citadel was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage of secrets. The fires below were still burning, a ring of orange hate surrounding the mountain. But the fire inside Elara was far more dangerous. She stood on the balcony, the wind whipping her hair as she looked down at the clouds she had once feared. Malakor stood in the doorway, his wings tattered and his head bowed, the space between them a canyon that no wing could cross. I didn't know the truth of the war, Elara. I only knew that I was the last of the winged, he whispered, his voice a ragged plea. Deep down, she knew the truth. She wanted to believe him because his scent still made her wolf want to howl in surrender. Rather than forgive him, she turned her back to the abyss. As his name left her lips, the space between them burned with a new icy resolve. "The Alpha is at the gate, Malakor," she said, her voice a cold hum that mirrored the mountain air. "And the ghosts are in the halls." The king didn't argue. Instead, he stepped into the light, his eyes flashing with a desperate need to reclaim the trust he had never truly earned. Before either could speak, the first of the silver siege bolts for the morning hit the main gate, and the roar of Varric's voice carried on the wind. He had found a way to bridge the gap. As if fate whispered a challenge, Elara realized that Act 4 wasn't about surviving the fall. It was about surviving the truth. What followed was a night of preparation where the romance was eclipsed by the cold necessity of war. Elara looked at Malakor, and, for the first time, she didn't see a savior. She saw a man who had to prove he was better than his blood. That's why she walked to the very edge of the spire, because she had to master the sky before the ground swallowed them both. And as the silence roared, she let the first feather break through her skin. The silver feather didn't just sprout. It burned through Elara's skin like a shard of frozen starlight. The wind didn't just blow, it howled, a raw, jagged symphony that called to the ancient blood screaming in her veins. She stood on the very precipice of the Sunless Citadel, her heart hammering against her ribs like a prisoner who finally saw the key. Deep down, she knew the truth. She was terrified that the weight of Malakor's family secrets would ground her before she ever tasted the clouds. She looked at her hands where the ghostly light was now solidifying into shimmering, razor-sharp down. But then, the iron gate below buckled under the force of Varric's siege engine, the sound of splintering wood echoing up the spire. Her heart skipped because she realized that if she didn't fly now, the Alpha would turn this mountain into a graveyard for her and her unborn pup. What followed was a surge of primal power that made her world tilt. In that moment, Elara didn't see the abyss as a threat. She saw it as her only chance to survive the sins of the past. Before she could move, Malakor was there. his wings tattered and his eyes full of a desperate, pleading love. "Elara, wait. Your body isn't ready for the full shift," he roared, his voice cracking with a fear she had never heard before. As if fate demanded it, she felt her pulse race, the silver mark on her neck pulsing with a heat that made the air shimmer. She wasn't going to wait for permission from the son of her ancestor's executioner. Next, she took a single defiant step into the empty air, and for a heartbeat, gravity tried to claim her again. Soon after, the pain exploded. Because she was a descendant of the first flight, her bones had to break to make room for the sky. She let out a scream that shattered the nearby stone, her back arching, her muscles tearing, as two massive luminescent wings burst through her skin. Still, Malakor didn't hesitate. He dove after her, his own dark wings snapping open to catch her if she faltered. What would you do if the person who broke your heart was the only one strong enough to help you mend your wings? In the span of a breath, the sky became a battlefield of light and shadow. Elara watched as the first silver bolts from Varric's army hissed past her, their violet trails cutting through the clouds like poison. Yet the sensation of flight was intoxicating, a rush of ice and fire that made her feel more alive than she had ever been in the Iron Claw pack. To make things worse, a secondary wave of winged berserkers, monstrous hybrids Varric had created in secret, rose from the smoke below to meet them. Under the weight of his stare, Elara saw Malakor bank hard, his claws extended to intercept the first of the beasts. He was being a shield. He was a warrior. He was her mate, no matter what the ghosts said. Because of that, the anger in her soul began to transform into a cold, lethal focus. Elara didn't just hover, she soared, the wind carrying her higher than any land-bound wolf could ever dream. Because she was the Alpha's greatest nightmare, she was the only one who could turn the tide of this war. She felt a strange, agonizing pressure in her chest, a feeling of a song rising, a feeling of a storm breaking, a feeling of a goddess claiming her throne that made the clouds turn to silver. "Watch me," she screamed, her voice a clarion call that rallied the grounded Lycans below. Without warning, she dived, not away from the fight, but directly into the heart of Varric's aerial horde. In that moment, the king looked at her with a mix of terror and absolute devotion. He had taught her the gravity of grace, but she was teaching him the fury of the moon. In the quiet that followed her first strike, 3 berserkers fell like stones, their dark magic extinguished by the touch of her celestial light. Still, the cost of the shift was tearing her apart from the inside. Her soul answered the call, but her body felt like it was being scorched by 1,000 suns. That night, the sky above the citadel was a canvas of fire and blood. The siege was no longer a one-sided slaughter. It was a revolution. Elara landed on the highest parapet, her wings glowing with a dim, exhausted silver as she looked down at the carnage. Malakor landed beside her, his chest heaving and his face covered in the soot of the battle. "You did it, Elara. You actually flew," he whispered, his voice trembling with a vulnerability that pierced her anger. Deep down, she knew the truth. Or she still loved him, because his scent was the only thing that kept her anchored to her humanity. Rather than forgive him with words, she reached out and pulled him into a searing, desperate kiss. As his name left her lips, the space between them burned with a passion that was forged in the fire of betrayal and war. "Don't let me fall, Malakor," she whispered against his skin. "Not again." The king didn't argue. Instead, he wrapped his tattered wings around her, a dark cocoon against the freezing wind, the bond pulsing between them like a drum of war. Before either could speak, a massive silver bolt, larger than any before, slammed into the spire beneath their feet. As if fate whispered a final warning, the stone began to crumble. Elara realized that Varric hadn't just come to capture her. He had come to bring the entire mountain down. What followed was a moment of terrifying silence as the balcony gave way, sending them both plunging into the smoke. Elara looked at Malakor, and, for the first time, she didn't see the past. She saw their future. That's why she snapped her wings open, because she had to be the one to carry them both through the fire. And as the silence roared, she let the light take over. The light didn't just fade, it suffocated as the smoke from the collapsing spire swallowed Elara whole. The world didn't just shake, it broke, a raw, jagged roar of stone and silver that heralded their descent into the dark. She plummeted through the debris, her wings tangling with Malakor's as they fell toward the burning forest below. Deep down, she knew the truth. She had finally found her sky, only for the Alpha to pull it down around her ears like a tattered shroud. She looked for Malakor's hand through the grey ash, her heart hammering like a trapped bird against a chest that felt like it was filled with broken glass. But then, the air was sliced by a high-pitched, metallic whistle. Her heart skipped because she realized the silver bolts weren't just falling. They were being steered by a dark force that wanted her blood. What followed was a crushing impact that made her world tilt. In that moment, Elara didn't hit the ground. She hit a massive silver-woven net that had been strung between the scorched pines by Varric's elite trackers. Before she could move, the silver wire bit into her skin, the metal singing a song of agony that suppressed her celestial fire instantly. "Malakor!" she screamed, her voice a ragged shadow of the command she had held moments before. As if fate demanded it, she saw the king hit the earth a few yards away, his dark wings pinned by heavy, silver-tipped harpoons. She wasn't going to let them take him. But the more she thrashed, the deeper the silver teeth sank into her wings. Next, the shadows of the forest parted to reveal Varric, no longer just an alpha, but a monster draped in the skins of the Lycans he had slaughtered. Soon after, the alpha approached her cage of wire, his sneer a jagged scar under the moonlight. Because he was a man who thrived on the brokenness of others, he reached through the mesh to grip her chin with bruising force. "You thought you could fly away from your master, Omega?" he hissed, his breath smelling of rot and victory. Her heart skipped because she saw the massive culling blade at his hip, the steel etched with the names of every weakling he had ever erased. She didn't want to look at Malakor, who was struggling against his own bonds, his silver eyes dulling with every pulse of the silver metal. What would you do if your highest peak turned into your deepest pit, and the monster who broke you was the only one left standing? In the span of a breath, the forest became a theatre of cruelty. Elara watched as Varric's men dragged Malakor toward a jagged altar of stone, the king's blood staining the ash-covered grass. Yet, the worst part wasn't the physical pain, it was the psychological silence. To make things worse, she felt the bond with Malakor go cold, a sudden jagged void where his warmth used to be. Under the weight of Varric's stare, Elara realized the Alpha's true plan. He didn't want her back as Luna. He wanted to harvest the celestial power from her unborn pup to make his own pack immortal. Because of that, a despair deeper than the abyss settled into her marrow. Elara didn't scream anymore. She went still, the light in her eyes fading as she watched Varric raise the blade over Malakor's throat. Because she had dared to hope, the universe was punishing her with a front-row seat to the end of everything. She felt a strange, agonizing hollow in her womb, a feeling of a heartbeat slowing, a feeling of a future dying, a feeling of a mother failing that made the air turn to ice. "Please," she whispered, her voice a low hum of total defeat. Without warning, Varric didn't strike the king. Instead, he turned the blade toward her, the silver reflecting the cold, dead look in her eyes. In that moment, Ko the Alpha looked at her with a mix of triumph and absolute madness. He had brought her to her knees, and he intended to keep her there forever. In the quiet that followed his mocking laughter, the forest seemed to die, the trees themselves turning to ash under the weight of her grief. Still, the pup kicked once, a small, desperate reminder of the life she was about to lose. Her soul answered with a whimper, her body hitting the dirt as the silver net tightened one last time. That night, the Sunless Citadel was a silhouette of ruin against a bloody moon. The revolution was over, or so it seemed, the ground wolves howling their victory as they feasted on the remains of the Lycan pride. Elara sat in the silver cage, her wings broken and her spirit shattered, the cold iron of the wire the only thing she could feel. A Malakor lay motionless a few feet away, his breathing shallow and his once majestic wings shredded like old silk. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the dark, her voice thick with the salt of her tears. Deep down, she knew the truth. She had led him into this trap because she thought she was a goddess. But she was just a girl who forgot how to fall. Rather than answer, the darkness seemed to press closer, the ghosts of the sky shifters mocking her from the shadows. As his name left her lips, the space between them felt like a graveyard, the passion and fire of the previous nights buried under the weight of their failure. "I failed you," she sobbed, her hand reaching through the wire toward his cold fingers. The king didn't move. Instead, the wind carried the scent of Varric's scent-masking herbs, a reminder that the Alpha was already preparing the culling ceremony for dawn. Before either could speak, the first light of the false morning touched the trees, and the forest held its breath for the execution. As if fate whispered a final insult, Elara realized that Act 6 wasn't just about losing the war. It was about losing herself. What followed was a night of total silence where the only sound was the drip of blood onto the thirsty earth. Elara looked at Malakor, and for the first time, she didn't see a king. She saw a man she had destroyed. That's why she closed her eyes, because she couldn't bear to see the sun rise on his death. And as the silence roared, she let the darkness take her. The darkness didn't just take her. It began to burn with a cold, silver flame that Varric's wires couldn't touch. The silence of the forest didn't just hang, it throbbed, a raw, jagged pulse of ancient power that began to mend the shattered pieces of Elara's soul. She lay in the dirt, her eyes closed, until the sound of a tiny rhythmic heartbeat filled her ears like a drum of war. Deep down, she knew the truth. She had let her fear ground her, forgetting that a celestial queen doesn't need a mountain to reach the stars. She looked deep within the void, where the silver fire was no longer a flicker, but a roaring furnace of maternal rage. But then, the first ray of the true dawn hit the silver cage, and the metal didn't just glow. It screamed in protest against the light. Her heart skipped because she realized the silver wasn't suppressing her power anymore. It was acting as a conductor for the lightning in her blood. What followed was a moment of absolute terrifying rebirth that made her world tilt. In that moment, Elara didn't see the cage as a prison. She saw it as the source of her liberation. Before she could move, Varric approached the altar, the culling blade raised high as he prepared to claim Malakor's life for his dark ritual. "Look at your king one last time, Omega," he sneered, his voice a low velvet caress of pure malice. As if fate demanded it, she felt her pulse race, the silver mark on her neck erupting into a blinding celestial white. She wasn't going to let the sun rise on a world without the man who taught her to fly. Next, the ground beneath the cage began to liquefy, the silver wires melting like wax under the intensity of her rising heat. Soon after, the forest was bathed in a light so pure it turned the ash to silver dust. Because she was the mother of a new world, the earth itself began to answer her call, the roots of the scorched pines lashing out to trip Varric's guards. She stood up, her broken wings snapping into place with a sound like grinding diamonds. Still Malakor didn't move. His eyes remained closed, but she felt the bond pulse with a sudden, desperate surge of life. What would you do if the darkness tried to swallow your sun, and you realized you were the dawn? In the span of a breath, the clearing became a temple of moonlight. Elara watched as the melted silver from her cage flowed toward her, wrapping around her arms and legs like divine armor. Yet, the transformation was no longer a struggle. It was an ascension. To make things worse for the Alpha, the weakness he had tried to cull was now the very thing that was blinding his army. Under the weight of her stare, Elara saw Varric stumble back, the culling blade trembling in his hand, as he looked at the goddess standing in the ruins of his trap. He was being judged. He was being eclipsed. He was being erased. Because of that, the first strike didn't come from a claw, but from a command. Elara didn't just scream. She roared, the sound of a sonic wave of silver energy that shattered the silver-tipped harpoons pinning Malakor to the earth. Because she was the Alpha's greatest miscalculation, she was the only one who could rewrite the rules of his hunt. She felt a strange, agonizing joy in her chest, a feeling of a cage breaking, a feeling of a sky opening, a feeling of a queen returning that made the trees bow in her wake. "To pick up your blade, Varric," she commanded, her voice echoing with the authority of 1,000 ancestors. Without warning, she lunged, not with the desperation of a victim, but with the precision of a predator. In that moment, the king's eyes snapped open, his silver irises catching the light of her transformation. He had taught her the gravity of grace, but she was showing him the immortality of love. In the quiet that followed her first strike, the silver armor on her arms hummed, absorbing the strike of Varric's blade as if it were nothing but a whisper. Still, the victory wasn't just about the fight. Her soul answered the call, and for the first time, she felt the pup within her shift, its own tiny spark of magic joining hers. That morning, the forest was no longer a graveyard. It was a nursery for a revolution. The ground wolves were no longer howling, They were whimpering, their predatory instincts overruled by the celestial radiance of the woman they had once mocked. Elara stood over Malakor, her hand outstretched, her glowing fingers tracing the air above his wounds until the flesh began to knit back together. Malakor reached up, his hand shaking as he touched the silver-clad skin of her arm. "Elara," he whispered, his voice thick with a wonder that surpassed his pain. Deep down, she knew the truth. She was no longer his to save, because she had become the salvation. Rather than help him up, she waited for him to find his own strength. As his name left her lips, the space between them burned with a renewed, unbreakable bond that had survived the deepest dark. "Stand, Malakor," she said, her voice a warm hum that carried the promise of the coming storm. "The Alpha still breathes, and the sky is waiting." The king didn't argue. Instead, he forced himself to his feet, his shredded wings beginning to shimmer with the reflected light of her power. Before either could speak, Varric let out a final desperate howl, his body shifting into a distorted, jagged beast that was more shadow than wolf. As if fate whispered a final challenge, Elara realized that Act 7 wasn't just about the escape. It was about reckoning. What followed was a moment of shared resolve, where the king and the queen stood side by side against the monster of their past. Elara looked at Malakor, and for the first time, she didn't see a king. She saw a man who was ready to fly into the sun with her. That's why she spread her luminescent wings, because she had to be the one to lead the hunt back to the peaks. And, as the silence roared, she let the final battle begin. The final battle didn't just begin, it exploded as Elara and Malakor took to the sky in a synchronized burst of silver and shadow. The forest floor didn't just vanish, it became a blur, a raw, jagged mosaic of fire and ash as they circled the monstrosity that Varric had become. She felt the wind rushing past her ears, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like an extension of her own soul. Deep down, she knew the truth. The Alpha had pushed her from the cliff to silence her, but he had only taught the world how to listen to her roar. She looked at Malakor, whose tattered wings were now reinforced by the moonlight leaking from her skin, his every movement a testament to the trust they had forged in the dark. But then, Varric lunged, a mass of jagged shadow and silver spite, his claws reaching for the light that had eclipsed him. Her heart skipped, because she realized this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight to end the cycle of the cull forever. What followed was a collision of celestial fire and primal hunger that made her world tilt. In that moment, Elara didn't flinch. She met the Alpha's charge head-on, her silver-clad arms glowing with the heat of 1,000 stars. Before she could move, Varric's shadow claws tore at her shield, the dark magic hissing as it touched her divine radiance. "You are still just an Omega," he shrieked, his voice a low velvet caress of madness that echoed through the trees. As if fate demanded it, she felt her pulse race, the pup within her kicking with a power that lent her its own tiny, fierce strength. She wasn't going to let the past dictate the future of the life she carried. Next, she banked hard to the left, allowing Malakor to dive from the clouds, his dark wings folding as he struck Varric with the force of a falling mountain. Soon after, the Alpha hit the earth with a sound that shook the very roots of the mountain. Because she was the judge of his sins, Elara followed him down, her luminescent wings spreading wide to catch the air as she landed in the center of the clearing. She stood over him, the silver fire in her palms illuminating the coward hiding behind the monster's mask. Still Varric tried to rise, his body flickering between man and beast, his breath a ragged whistle of defeat. What would you do if the person who broke you was now begging for the mercy you never received? In the span of a breath, the clearing became a courtroom of the gods. Elara watched as the remaining ground wolves turned their backs on their fallen alpha, their instincts finally recognizing a power greater than fear. Yet, the climax wasn't a strike of a blade, it was a whisper of the truth. To make things worse for the tyrant, the silver armor on Elara's arms began to pulse with the memories of the ancestors he had slaughtered. Under the weight of her stare, Elara saw Varric finally realize that his perfection was his prison. He was being broken, he was being forgotten, he was being judged. Because of that, the final strike didn't come from hate, but from justice. Elara didn't just roar, she channeled every ounce of the celestial fire into a single, blinding beam of moonlight that hit Varric's chest. Because she was the Alpha's greatest failure, she was the only one who could grant him his end. She felt a strange, agonizing peace in her heart, a feeling of a debt paid, a feeling of a sky cleared, a feeling of a family born that made the shadows vanish from the forest forever. "Fall," she whispered, her voice a clarion call that silenced the night. Without warning, the Alpha disintegrated, not into blood, but into ash that the wind carried away toward the abyss he had once loved. In that moment, the king landed beside her, his human form returning as he wrapped his arms around her trembling frame. He had taught her the gravity of grace, and she had given him the world. In the quiet that followed the dissolution of the dark, the sun finally broke over the horizon. A warm, golden light that turned the Sunless Citadel into a palace of glass. Still, the victory wasn't just in the death of their enemy. Her soul answered the call of the dawn, and for the first time, she felt her pup settle into a peaceful sleep. That morning, the world was no longer a battlefield. It was a home. The Lycans and the ground shifters didn't fight. They watched in silence as their king and queen walked back toward the mountain, their hands entwined and their wings shimmering in the light. Elara looked at Malakor, and for the first time she saw a man who was no longer haunted by his bloodline. Deep down, she knew the truth. They were the architects of a new era, because their love was the only law that mattered. Rather than look back at the ruin, she looked up at the sky. As his name left her lips, the space between them burned with a promise of a happily ever after that was earned in the fire. "We are the sky, Malakor," she whispered, her voice a low hum of absolute contentment. The king didn't argue. Instead, he leaned down and kissed her with a passion that tasted of freedom and the future. Before either could speak, the first of the Lycan children, the weak ones who had been hidden away, came out into the light, their eyes wide with wonder as they saw a queen who could fly. As if fate whispered a final blessing, Elara realized that Act 8 wasn't just the end of a war. It was the beginning of a legend. What followed was a celebration that lasted for 7 days, where the romance of the winged king and his celestial queen became the song of the mountain. Elara stood on the balcony of the restored citadel, her hand on her stomach, and her wings catching the breeze. That's why she smiled, because she had survived the fall to prove that the only way to truly live is to let the light take over. And as the silence roared, she let the music of the sky play on.